The fog rolled in thick over the Dorset countryside that November evening in 1944, turning the hedgerows into ghostly sentinels and muffling the distant rumble of supply trucks heading toward the coast. Private James Sullivan stood at the edge of the village green in Weimoth, watching lamplight spill from the windows of the Rose and Crown pub across the square. Inside, he could hear laughter, real laughter, the kind that rose naturally from people enjoying each other's company without the weight of invisible boundaries pressing down on every interaction. He'd been in England for 8 months now, assigned to a quartermaster battalion that kept the vast machinery of the Allied invasion supplied and moving. 8 months that had somehow rewritten everything he thought he understood about the world and his place in it. James came from Birmingham's Alabama, though that Birmingham felt like it belonged to another lifetime now, another universe entirely. He'd grown up in the shadow of the steel mills, in a neighborhood where the streets turned to red mud when it rained, and where every interaction with white authority carried the potential for humiliation, or worse. His father had worked at the Sloss furnaces for 32 years, coming home each evening coated in iron dust, his lungs gradually failing from breathing air thick with particles that settled in tissue and never left. James had watched his father remove his hat for white men half his age, had seen him step off sidewalks to let white women pass, had absorbed the 1,000 small degradations that made up daily life under Jim Crow. The army had seemed like an escape, or at least a kind of distant nobility, fighting for democracy, for freedom, for ideals that might somehow extend to include him if he proved himself worthy enough. But Fort Benning had taught him quickly that the uniform changed nothing fundamental. The segregated training facilities, the white officers who spoke to black soldiers with barely concealed contempt, the separate mess halls and barracks, the regulations that kept black units relegated to support roles while white soldiers prepared for combat glory, all of it had been a continuation of the same system, just dressed in olive drab. Then he'd crossed the Atlantic, expecting more of the same in Britain, expecting the world to be one unbroken landscape of separation and subordination. Instead, he'd found this. James crossed the green and pushed open the door of the Rose and Crown. The warmth hit him immediately. The coal fire burning in the grate, the press of bodies, the smell of weak wartime beer and cigarette smoke. Heads turned as he entered, and he felt the old instinct rise up, the readiness to assess threat, to calculate the safest response to attention. But then Tom Whitfield, the publican, raised a hand in greeting. "Evening, James. Usual spots open for you." Just like that. No hesitation, no sudden silence, no cold stares. James made his way to the corner table where he'd spent dozens of evenings now, and within moments, Margaret Hartley appeared with a pint of mild, setting it down with a smile that reached her eyes. "Busy night," she said, glancing around at the crowd. "Half the village is in here, seems like." Margaret was the publican's niece, 23 years old, with dark hair she wore pinned back and hands roughened from farm work. She'd been helping at the pub since her husband shipped out with the British Expeditionary Force in 1940 and never came back from Dunkirk. James had learned her story in pieces over weeks of conversation, the way you learn about people when there's no rush, when genuine interest replaces the performance of social interaction. "Your letters came today," she added, lowering her voice slightly. "Mr. Whitfield held them behind the bar for you." James nodded his thanks. Having mail sent to the pub had become necessary after his company's executive officer, Captain Rawlings, had started making pointed comments about the volume of local correspondence some of the black soldiers were receiving. Nothing explicitly forbidden, of course, but the message was clear. Relationships with British civilians were being noted and disapproved of. Captain Rawlings was from somewhere in Georgia, and he'd brought the attitudes of his homeland with him intact across the ocean. He'd tried, in the early weeks of the American build-up, to convince local pub owners to maintain separate areas for white and black soldiers. He'd suggested to the local constabulary that they might want to keep a closer watch on areas where Black GIs congregated. He'd even attempted to pressure British women who were seen walking with black soldiers, warning them about the consequences of such associations. The British had responded with a collective and polite refusal that must have baffled Rawlings completely. The pub owners served whoever came through their doors. The police saw no reason to monitor soldiers who were behaving themselves, and the British women, many of whom had husbands and brothers and sons fighting overseas, many of whom understood loneliness and the arbitrary cruelty of separation, made their own choices about their friendships and their company. This bewildered the white American officers more than perhaps anything else in Britain. They'd expected their racial hierarchy to be understood and respected as natural law, the way it was at home. Instead, they found themselves in a country that looked at their segregation efforts with genuine confusion and mild contempt. James sipped his beer and watched the room. Old Mr. Brennan was at his usual spot by the fire, talking to two of James's friends from the battalion, Henry Davis from Chicago and William Foster from Philadelphia. They were laughing about something, and Mr. Brennan was gesturing broadly with his pipe, telling some story from the Great War, probably. At another table, several British soldiers on leave were playing darts with Robert Jackson, another Black GI, their friendly competition drawing occasional cheers from onlookers. This was the thing that still struck James every time, even after 8 months, the ordinariness of it all, the simple, unremarkable fact of being included, of being treated as just another person in the room, another soldier far from home, another human being entitled to basic dignity and courtesy. He thought about a night back in Birmingham, 3 weeks before he'd shipped out. He'd gone to a drugstore to buy aspirin for his mother's headaches, and the white clerk had made him wait while she served 5 white customers who'd entered after him. When she finally, reluctantly acknowledged his presence, she'd asked what he wanted without looking at him, had taken his money without touching his hand, had given him his change by dropping it on the counter rather than placing it in his palm. The whole transaction had been designed to communicate his essential worthlessness, his contaminating presence. Here in Weymouth, Mrs. Patterson at the greengrocer had argued with him last week about whether he should pay for the apples he'd selected, insisting he take them as thanks for American help in the war. The baker's daughter, Emily, always saved him an extra roll when he came in. The elderly woman at the post office had knitted him a scarf when she'd noticed him shivering in the November damp. These were small things, perhaps, but they accumulated into something profound, the revelation that the degradation he'd lived with all his life wasn't natural or inevitable. It was a choice that some people made and others simply didn't. Margaret returned to his table, her shift evidently done for the evening. "May I sit?" "Of course." She settled into the chair across from him, her own half-pint in hand. They'd fallen into this pattern over the past few months. Quiet conversation at the end of busy evenings, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about life in the village, about the farms struggling with rationing and labor shortages, about her young nephew who collected American comic books and pestered every GI he met for new issues. He told her about Birmingham, about his family, about books he'd read and music he loved and dreams he'd had before the war taught him how small his world was meant to be. "You're quiet tonight," she observed. James turned his glass slowly on the scarred wood table. "I've been thinking about going home. But about what happens after the war." "Yeah," he looked up at her. "We got word today that the company might ship out soon. Not to combat," he added, seeing her expression shift. "Just redeployment, moving supplies closer to the continent. But it started me thinking about what comes after all this. When it's over and we go back." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and James could see her choosing her words carefully. They'd never spoken explicitly about this, about what his return to America would mean, about the life that waited for him there. But the understanding had been growing between them for weeks now, an acknowledgement that lived in the space between their words. "Do you want to go back?" she asked finally. It was the question he'd been avoiding asking himself directly, though it had been circling in his mind with increasing insistence. Do you want to go back? Such a simple question, such an impossible one. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think about my family, my mother, my sisters. I think about them all the time. But then I think about—" He gestured vaguely at the room, at the ordinary scene of people sharing space without the architecture of segregation structuring every interaction. "This, what it's been like here. And I don't know if I can go back to how things were before." "It won't be the same, will it?" Margaret said quietly. "After you've experienced something different." "No," James agreed. "It won't be the same." Across the room, Henry Davis caught his eye and raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. Henry had been saying similar things for weeks now, though with more bitter humour. Henry had gotten engaged to a girl from Newport before shipping out, had her photograph in his footlocker and her letters arriving weekly. But he'd started spending time with a British woman named Catherine, a widow who worked at the naval office in town, and the guilt was eating him alive, even as he seemed unable to stop seeing her. He'd said to James once, late at night in the barracks, "How am I supposed to explain this to Diane? How do I tell her that over here I'm just a man, that people look me in the eye when they talk to me, that I can walk into any establishment I want and nobody tries to throw me out? How do I explain that I'm terrified to come home because home means going back to being nothing?" The contradiction was crushing. They were serving in an army fighting against fascism and tyranny, fighting for freedom and democracy, while representing a country that denied those very principles to millions of its own citizens. And now they'd tasted something different, had experienced a glimpse of what life might be like without the constant weight of enforced inferiority. And the thought of return felt like a door closing on possibility. James had heard the rumours, whispered conversations in the barracks late at night. Some men were thinking about staying, about deserting when their units shipped home, about disappearing into British society, about abandoning their American identities entirely rather than return to the lives waiting for them in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and all the other places where their service and sacrifice would mean nothing the moment they removed their uniforms. It was dangerous talk. Desertion was a court-martial offence, potentially punishable by death, though more likely to result in years at hard labour. And it wasn't simple to just disappear in a foreign country, even one as welcoming as Britain had been. You needed papers, work, a place to live. You needed to build an entire new existence from nothing. But men were trying. James knew of at least 3 soldiers from other units who'd gone missing in recent months, officially listed as AWOL, but rumoured to be hiding out in London or Liverpool or Birmingham, sheltered by British families, working odd jobs, trying to build new lives. Whether they'd succeed or be found eventually was anyone's guess. "The military police are cracking down," Margaret said, as if reading his thoughts. Mrs. Whitfield heard from her cousin in Bristol that they're doing more frequent checks, going house to house in some areas looking for deserters. The MPs, military police, had become an increasingly hostile presence. They were mostly white soldiers from the South, chosen specifically because they'd enforced the army's racial codes with enthusiasm. They patrolled the areas where black soldiers socialized, looking for violations of curfew or dress code or any other regulation they could use as pretext for harassment. They'd beaten Henry Davis badly 3 months ago, claiming he'd been disrespectful to a white officer, though everyone knew the real offense was being seen walking with Catherine on the high street. "I heard about that," James said. "They found a soldier from the 92nd Infantry hiding in Manchester. Sent him back to the States in chains." "God," Margaret breathed. "In chains. That's how they do it. Make an example. Show the rest of us what happens if we get ideas above our station." The bitterness in his voice surprised him. He usually tried to maintain some emotional distance from all of this, to treat his situation with a kind of detached observation rather than let the anger consume him. But tonight, with the prospect of redeployment suddenly making everything feel immediate and final, the control was harder to maintain. Margaret reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else in the room, but it contained volumes: affection, solidarity, acknowledgement of his pain. And something more, something neither of them had named explicitly, but which had been growing steadily between them, over months of conversation and shared time. "You should come to Sunday dinner," she said, withdrawing her hand but holding his gaze. "Properly. I mean, Aunt Helen has been asking when you'll come by the house. She wants to hear about America, and Uncle Tom wants to show you his victory garden, such as it is." This, too, was part of the extraordinary ordinary of life in Britain: the casual inclusion in family life, the dinner invitations, the sense of being welcomed into homes and hearts. James had been to dinner with the Hartleys twice before, had shared their meagre rationed food while Mr. Whitfield told stories about running the pub since before the Great War, and Mrs. Whitfield asked thoughtful questions about Birmingham and what life was like there. They'd treated him exactly as they might treat any young man keeping company with their niece, with a kind of provisional acceptance that suggested future possibilities rather than temporary association. "I'd like that," James said. "If I'm still here Sunday." "You will be. The army never moves as fast as it threatens to." She was probably right. Military bureaucracy was its own special kind of purgatory, all hurry up and wait and contradictory orders. But the conversation had shifted something in James, had brought into focus thoughts and feelings he'd been avoiding confronting directly. He excused himself and stepped outside into the foggy evening. The air was cold and damp, carrying the salt smell of the channel and the faint industrial odor of the docks. He walked slowly through the empty streets, passing darkened shop windows and the occasional pedestrian hurrying home before full night fell. His mind wandered back across the years to specific moments and memories that had taught him who he was supposed to be in the world. He was 12 when he'd been slapped by a white store owner for not saying "sir" quickly enough. 14 when he'd watched his cousin get arrested for standing on the wrong corner, for existing in space that white Birmingham had deemed off-limits. 16 when he'd fallen in love with a girl from church, Sarah Johnson, and had that love stay secret and small because there was nowhere they could go together. Nothing they could do that wasn't monitored and circumscribed by the invisible rules that governed black life. He joined the army at 22 in early 1942, when the war was still new and the recruiting posters promised adventure and purpose. The irony hadn't been lost on him even then, fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. But he'd believed, or wanted to believe, that service might somehow earn him and others like him a place at the table, might prove their worth in a way that couldn't be denied. Britain had taught him something different, that worth didn't need to be proven because it was inherent. That dignity wasn't something you earned through exceptional service or behavior. It was something you possessed simply by being human, and no social system should be able to strip it away. Walking these streets at night, James had never once felt the hypervigilance that defined his experience of public space in Alabama. No one was going to stop him and demand to know his business. No one was going to call him boy or worse. No one was going to assume criminality based on his presence. The British people he'd encountered seemed genuinely puzzled by American racial attitudes, unable to understand why skin color should determine a person's fundamental rights and social position. He'd tried to explain Jim Crow to Mr. Brennan once, the old veteran who held court by the pub fire. Tried to describe the separate water fountains, the back entrances to buildings, the signs declaring whites only that punctuated the landscape of his childhood. Mr. Brennan had listened with growing incredulity and finally said, "But you're fighting for us. You're in uniform, serving king and country alongside everyone else. How can they treat you that way?" And James hadn't known how to explain that this was exactly the point, that the uniform meant nothing back home, that heroism and sacrifice were filtered through the lens of race and found wanting if the hero's skin was dark. He found himself at the edge of town, where the road curved down toward the harbour. The water was invisible in the fog, but he could hear it lapping against the breakwater, could sense the vast presence of the channel stretching away into darkness. Across that water was France, and beyond France was Germany, and somewhere in that direction was the war they were all supposedly here to fight. But for black soldiers, the real war had always been at home, the daily battle for basic human dignity, for the right to exist without fear and humiliation. Some of his fellow soldiers had embraced combat roles when they were finally allowed them, eager to prove themselves, to show their courage and capacity in ways that couldn't be dismissed. The 92nd Infantry Division was fighting in Italy now, taking casualties, taking ground, performing the same heroic and terrible work that all soldiers did in war. And James knew that when they came home, when those black veterans returned with their wounds and medals and trauma, they'd still be expected to step off sidewalks for white women, still be barred from white establishments, still face violence for looking white men in the eye. That was what made the question of return so agonizing. Not just that he'd be going back to oppression. He'd known that was waiting for him from the beginning, but that he'd be going back having experienced something different, carrying the knowledge that another way of living was possible, that he could be seen and treated as fully human. That knowledge would be a weight and a wound, making every future degradation sharper and more unbearable. A figure emerged from the fog, and James tensed before recognizing William Foster, another man from his unit. William was from Philadelphia, had worked in a factory there before the war, and had been seeing a British woman named Alice for the past 6 months. "Couldn't sleep?" William asked, falling into step beside him. "Something like that. You?" "Alice asked me to marry her." James stopped walking and turned to look at his friend. "She what?" William laughed, but there was no humour in it. "I know. I thought I'd misheard her at first, but no, she wants to marry me before we ship out. Says she doesn't care what happens after. She just wants us to be married, to make it official." "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd think about it." William pulled out a cigarette, cupped his hands against the wind to light it. "But we both know what it means. She's giving me a reason to stay, giving me a way to stay. British wives of American soldiers. They'll get to come to the States eventually, once everything's sorted after the war. But until then," he trailed off. But James understood. Until then, William would have a legitimate reason to remain in Britain, would have paperwork and a relationship that provided cover for not returning with his unit. "You thinking about it, really thinking about it?" William drew on his cigarette, the tip glowing briefly in the darkness. "Every damn day. I think about Philadelphia, about my family, about the neighborhood where I grew up. And then I think about trying to explain to Alice what life will be like there. Trying to explain that we won't be able to live in most neighborhoods, that we'll face harassment and worse, that any children we have will grow up in the same system I'm trying to escape. Your family, I know. Believe me, I know. My mother's letters come every week, telling me how proud she is, how the whole church prays for me. How am I supposed to tell her I'm not coming home, that I'm choosing to stay with a white woman in England rather than return to my own family?" The anguish in William's voice was raw and painful. "But James, man, I can't. I just can't go back to that life. Not after this." They stood together in the fog and darkness, two men far from home, caught between impossible choices. The war had fractured something in both of them, had opened a space between who they'd been expected to be and who they'd discovered they might become. "There's going to be a reckoning," James said quietly. "After the war, when all us black soldiers come home having fought for freedom, having seen how other places treat their citizens, there's going to be a reckoning." "Maybe," William said, "or maybe nothing changes. Maybe we just go back to how things were, and all of this," he gestured vaguely at the invisible town around them, "all of this just becomes a memory, something we tell our grandchildren about, how things were different during the war." James wanted to believe otherwise, wanted to believe that the service and sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of black soldiers would mean something, would force America to confront its contradictions. But he'd lived enough history to know that hope and justice didn't always align, that the arc of the moral universe might bend toward justice, but it bent slowly and with painful resistance. They walked back toward the barracks together, the conversation drifting to safer topics, sports, music, the quality of army food. But the weight of their earlier words hung between them, the knowledge that they were both wrestling with the same fundamental question: what do you owe to a country that has never fully acknowledged your humanity? The next several weeks passed in the strange, suspended time of military life, where days blurred together in routine, but rumors of movement kept everyone perpetually on edge. The promised redeployment kept getting delayed. Weather, logistics, strategic considerations that filtered down through the chain of command in fragmentary and contradictory forms. James continued to spend his free time in Weymouth, continued his pattern of evenings at the Rose and Crown and Sunday dinners with the Hartleys. The relationship between him and Margaret had deepened into something neither of them explicitly named, but both clearly felt. They'd take long walks along the harbour, talking about everything: books, politics, dreams, fears. She told him about her brief marriage, about the telegram that had ended it, about the strange guilt she felt for having begun to feel something for someone else. He told her about growing up under segregation, about the violence and fear that had shaped his childhood, about his dreams of maybe going to college after the war, though he had no idea how he'd afford it, or whether any institution would accept him. One Sunday afternoon in early December, sitting in the Hartleys' parlour with weak tea and precious rationed biscuits, Mr. Whitfield had said something that stayed with James. They'd been discussing the future, the post-war world that everyone was trying to imagine, and the older man had fixed James with a serious look. "You know you'd be welcome here, lad. After all this is done, Britain could use good men helping rebuild. We lost so many in the last war, and we'll lose more before this one's finished. A young man willing to work, willing to be part of the community, that's worth something here." The offer was implicit rather than direct, wrapped in the careful language of hypotheticals, but James understood what was being communicated, that if he wanted to stay, if he chose not to return to America, the Hartleys would help him, would provide cover and support and connection, would treat him as one of their own. He'd thank them, non-committally, but the conversation had settled something in him, made the possibility real rather than purely theoretical. There was a path forward, if he wanted to take it. A way to build a life here, in this place where he'd found something approximating freedom. But there were complications that Mr. Whitfield's kind offer couldn't resolve. James wasn't a free agent. He was property of the United States Army, bound by oath and contract and the threat of court-martial. Desertion wasn't a simple matter of just staying behind when his unit shipped out. It would mean living in hiding, always looking over his shoulder, always risking discovery and punishment. It would mean abandoning his family without explanation, letting them believe he was dead or captured or simply gone. It would mean severing every connection to his previous life, becoming someone else entirely. And it would mean giving up the hope, however faint, that things might change in America, that the sacrifices of this generation might create a better future for the next. The moral calculus was impossible. There was no right answer, only different configurations of loss and compromise. In mid-December, the orders finally came through. The battalion would ship out after Christmas, heading to Southampton and then across to France to support the final push into Germany. There would be a brief leave period first, 48 hours, for enlisted men to handle their affairs and say their goodbyes. James requested permission to spend his leave in Weymouth rather than travelling to London where many of the other soldiers planned to go. Captain Rawlings had approved it with barely concealed disapproval, making pointed remarks about fraternization with locals that stopped just short of being explicitly racist, but left no doubt about his meaning. That last evening, James and Margaret walked down to the harbour as twilight fell. The December air was bitter cold, and their breath made clouds in the darkness. They walked in silence for a long time, both knowing this conversation had been inevitable, both dreading it. Finally, standing at the edge of the water with the lights of town twinkling behind them, Margaret spoke. "You're going to go back, aren't you? After the war?" It wasn't really a question, but James answered anyway. "I think I have to." "Because of your family?" "Partly, but also because—" He struggled to articulate something he was only beginning to understand himself. "Because running away doesn't change anything, it just saves me. And maybe that's enough, maybe that's all anyone can ask. But I keep thinking about all the others, all the black people back home who can't leave, who don't have this choice. And if everyone who sees how wrong it is just abandons them, nothing ever changes." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "That's very noble, and very stupid." Despite everything, James laughed. "Yeah, probably both. You don't owe them your happiness, James. You don't owe them your whole life." "Don't I, though? My mother, my sisters, they don't get to choose whether to stay or leave. They're stuck there, living with everything I'd be running from. How do I justify my freedom when theirs is impossible?" "You can't save them by going back. One man can't change a whole system." "No," James agreed, "but maybe enough men, enough people refusing to accept it, maybe that changes things. Maybe if everyone who served, who saw something different, comes back and demands better, maybe that matters." He didn't entirely believe his own words, or rather, he believed them intellectually while doubting them emotionally. The rational part of his mind knew that systemic change required collective action, required people willing to fight for it. But the emotional part, the part that had found something precious in Weymouth, wanted desperately to stay, to choose his own happiness over abstract principles of justice. Margaret moved closer, and he put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her warmth against the cold. "I'll write," he said, "every week. And after the war, when everything's settled, maybe—" He didn't finish the sentence, because they both knew the maybe was almost certainly a lie, a comfortable fiction they were telling themselves to make the separation bearable. "Maybe," Margaret agreed softly, accepting the fiction because the truth was too painful to confront directly. They stood together as full darkness fell, watching the last light fade from the sky, neither wanting to be the first to suggest they return to town. This moment, this peace, this simple human connection, it would have to sustain them both through whatever came next. The next morning, James boarded the truck that would take his unit back to their staging area near Southampton. Henry Davis climbed in beside him, looking haggard and miserable. William Foster was absent. He'd married Alice 3 days earlier in a quiet ceremony at the village church, and he'd put in for transfer to a unit remaining in Britain, claiming expertise that made him more valuable for occupation duty. Whether that would work or whether he'd face court-martial for the attempted evasion was anyone's guess. As the truck pulled away from Weymouth, James looked back at the town, at the ordinary streets and buildings that had given him 8 months of something he'd never experienced before. the simple dignity of being treated as a full human being, entitled to respect and inclusion without having to first prove his worth. Margaret stood on the corner near the pub, watching the convoy pass. Their eyes met for a moment, and then the truck turned a corner, and she was gone. The battalion spent Christmas in a cold, muddy camp outside Southampton, preparing for deployment to the continent. The work was grueling and endless, loading supplies, maintaining equipment, attending briefings about what awaited them in France and Germany. The news from the front was mixed. The Germans had launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes, and the Battle of the Bulge was consuming lives at a horrifying rate. On Christmas Eve, mail call brought letters from home. James received 3 from his mother, filled with news about the neighborhood, about church activities, about his sisters' lives. She wrote about how proud everyone was of his service, how the whole community prayed for his safe return. The letters were suffused with love and longing, and reading them, James felt the weight of obligation settle more heavily on his shoulders. But he also received a letter from Margaret, written the day after he'd left. She wrote about the ordinary life of Weimoth continuing in his absence, about her work at the pub and the farm, about the winter weather and the shortages. And then, at the end, she wrote something that James would carry with him through everything that followed. "You told me you have to go back because staying would be running away. I understand that, even if I hate it, but I want you to remember something, James. You found freedom here, even if only briefly. You know now that it exists, that it's possible, that you deserve it. Whatever happens when you return to America, don't let them convince you otherwise. Don't let them make you forget that you're entitled to walk through the world with your head up, that you're owed the same dignity and respect as anyone else. Promise me you'll remember that. Promise me you'll keep fighting for it, no matter how long it takes." James folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. In the cold barracks, surrounded by other soldiers writing letters home or playing cards or trying to sleep, he made her a silent promise. He would remember. He would carry this experience back with him, this knowledge of what life could be, and somehow, some way, he would work to create a world where no one had to cross an ocean to find basic human dignity. The battalion shipped out to France in early January of 1945. They followed the armies eastward, maintaining supply lines, moving mountains of material that kept the war machine functioning. James survived the winter and spring, survived the chaos of the war's final months, survived the overwhelming evidence of Nazi horrors that emerged as camps were liberated. Through it all, he carried Margaret's letter and the memory of Weimoth, of pubs where everyone was welcome, of dinners with families who saw him as simply another young man far from home, of streets where he could walk without fear or calculation. The war in Europe ended in May, but redeployment home was slow. James remained in Germany through the summer, helping with occupation duties, writing letters to Margaret and to his mother, trying to reconcile the two parts of himself that seemed increasingly incompatible, the man who'd found freedom in England and the son who owed something to the family and community that had shaped him. William Foster, he learned, had succeeded in remaining in Britain through a combination of marriage, useful skills, and sheer luck. Henry Davis had gone back to Chicago and written once a bitter letter about how nothing had changed, how the uniform meant nothing the moment he'd stepped off the train in the South Side. Other men from the unit had simply disappeared, officially listed as AWOL or deserters, but really just men who'd made a different choice, who'd valued their own freedom over the obligations and expectations that would have dragged them back into oppression. James didn't judge them. How could he, when he'd been so close to making the same choice? He finally boarded a ship home in September 1945, 6 months after the war's end. Standing at the rail as the coast of Britain disappeared into the distance, James thought about all the men who'd chosen to stay, who were even now building new lives in a country that had welcomed them. He thought about the approximately 2,000 children, The brown babies born to British women and Black American soldiers who would grow up in Britain, who would never know the particular version of America that would have claimed their fathers. He thought about what it meant that freedom had been found not in their homeland, but in the bombed-out cities and villages of wartime Britain. The ship steamed west across the Atlantic, toward home and family and everything that word contained, both beautiful and terrible. James stood at the rail long after Britain had vanished beyond the horizon. One hand pressed to the pocket where Margaret's letter rested against his heart, preparing himself for whatever came next. He was returning to America, but he was bringing something back with him that the country had never successfully given him before. The absolute, unshakable knowledge that he deserved better, that they all deserved better. And that knowledge, cultivated in the pubs and parlours and streets of a distant country during the strangest years of his life, would be a seed from which something new might eventually grow. The ship sailed on through the autumn seas, carrying James Sullivan and thousands of other black soldiers back to an America that had sent them away as second-class citizens and would receive them as the same. But they'd seen something different. They'd tasted something different. And that difference would not be forgotten, would not be easily suppressed. It would simmer and build through the years ahead, through the battles and struggles that would eventually become the civil rights movement, through all the long work of trying to make America live up to its stated ideals. James stood at the rail and watched the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Behind him was Britain and everything it had represented, the brief, bright interlude of dignity and belonging. Ahead was America. Complex and contradictory, beautiful and brutal, home and prison all at once. He'd chosen to return, had chosen obligation over personal freedom, had chosen to be part of whatever reckoning might eventually come. But he'd always carry Weimoth with him, always remember the Rose and Crown, the Sunday dinners with the Hartleys, the walks along the harbour with Margaret. Always remember what it felt like to be treated as fully human, entitled to respect and inclusion without qualification or compromise. That memory would have to be enough, would have to sustain him through everything that waited ahead, would have to be the North Star by which he'd navigate the difficult years to come. The ship sailed on, carrying its cargo of men who'd found a kind of home in a foreign land and were now returning to the complicated country of their birth. Men who'd learned that freedom was possible, that dignity was their birthright, that the way things had always been was not the way things had to remain. They were going home, but they were bringing the seeds of change with them, planted in the soil of their experiences, watered by the tears of impossible choices, and someday, somehow, those seeds would grow into something better. James held on to that hope as the last light faded from the sky and the ship sailed on through the darkness toward America.